Hello everybody, Jimmy here. I wanted to delve a little bit into some of the examples from chapter 4 because there was so much there to look at. I will mention that you can download all of the code examples for the book as one big set, or you can go to each individual link on this particular page, like chapter 4, and look at them individually. I will point out that the creating a figure page has an error. In the book there's a picture here, but apparently they forgot to put the actual picture up on the web. More about that in a minute. So let's jump into this. So I've got here the starting a paragraph example. I'm going to switch over to my text editor. I'm using BB Edit. It's the big brother to Text Wrangler, and it's by far my favorite. It isn't free though, so beware. So I've got here, notice that we've got an article, meaning that everything in between lines 9 and 19, everything between article and slash article, all of that data travels together. So it's a semantic way to say, hey, everything in between these two tags, all this information is related. Then there's some kind of sub delineations within that. There's an H1 that says this is the main heading for this article. There should only be one main heading per article or per section. However, you're going to break your page up. Usually articles are kind of the more common one, at least that's what I've seen. And then underneath each heading, notice there's an H1 right here because that's the major heading for this article, and then there's an H2 which is slightly smaller, and then H3 would be slightly smaller, and it gets, the sizes decrease. You can also alter with CSS what the different headings do. H1 is meant to be the biggest, and there's meant to be one per article. H2 is kind of the subheading of that, and if you could break it down farther if you wanted to. Each paragraph is set off, you'll notice, with its own blank stuff, so that at the beginning there's a blank line, at the end there's a blank line. So P/P sets off everything as a paragraph. And this should be the sort of generic way you do all of your coding. Even though article doesn't do anything other than set this up semantically, it's a metadata element that you, as an information professional, are adding to this page. So don't shy away from that. Okay, so there's that one. Now let's talk about figures. This is the picture I was talking about that's missing, that's in the text, but missing from his example. I went and did a little screenshot so we would see it here. So this chapter we did, I'm actually going to close that window and go to creating a figure. The assignment we did about images really kind of could have used this extra element. So I thought I'd talk about it here because some of you may want to add it, or I may add it as an extra feature next week. We'll see. Anyway, so we've got an article, we've got paragraphs, we've got an H1. All of that stuff is the same. By the way, the author does something that I also do, sort of a stepping things up as you go. You start with a generic framework and you add a little bit more detail and you add a little bit more detail, sort of a stepwise refinement kind of thing, and it tends to make for a better product. You focus on each individual piece, and once that's done, then you add on the new piece. So imagine starting with the sort of generic framework and then adding an article and then adding a figure, and as you build the page you get more and more sort of detail. Anyway, in the tag here, figure/figure, this really sets off the image tag as a picture, and with CSS later on we could add a lot more to that. But one of the coolest things that HTML5 gives you is this caption tag, which is brand new to HTML5. So if you bother to set off an image and the other stuff related to it inside this tag, the fig caption tag makes this a caption above the picture. Okay, so you can by default tie a picture to its caption. This is new to HTML5. You can do this with other versions of HTML. It's not really required, but it's a good idea to put a caption. It doesn't always fit for what you're doing, so it is there as a cool sort of feature. Thought I'd mention that. Okay, let's talk about the emphasize and bold and italics, as we used to call it. Let's look at that guy. What was that called? Important and emphasize text. Sorry about that. So notice here there are two things going on here. First of all, it's really good advice to not approach zombies under any circumstances. They may look friendly, but that's just because they want to eat your arm. That may or may not necessarily be true. Here in Houston we have zombie walks sometimes. So they're not real zombies. Still, if you're not sure, run away. Can't hurt. Anyway, notice that this is bold, like warning, do not approach the zombies under any circumstances. And then under any circumstances is in italics, okay? And look is in italics. Now, in older versions of HTML, there was a tag called B and a tag called I. B for bold, I for italics. And they're actually still around in HTML5, but they're considered kind of old or deprecated or on their way out or a stopgap until all the browsers catch up. I remember when HTML4 introduced the tag strong and the tag EM, strong for bold, EM for italics, that the promise was there would be no more bold and italics, and here in HTML5 we still have them both. So I'm going to tell you though that the more typical way to make something bold is to use the tag strong, and the more typical way to make something italics is to use the tag EM. Notice that they're nested here, so EM/EM under any circumstances, that part's in italics, but the entire phrase, warning, do not approach zombies under any circumstances, that whole thing is in bold. You can, with CSS, change what strong and EM do. The browser by default uses strong as bold and EM as italics, but you can change them around. Notice that over here, the rest of this phrase, they may look friendly, but the only part that's in italics is the EM, the only part that's emphasized, okay? So, that's a really, really common thing for people to do is bold and italics, and that's an easy way to do it. If you want to wait and fiddle around with the bold and italics with CSS, that's actually your right, but this is something the browser has built in. This is bold by default, and this one's italics by default, so there you go. Okay, cool. Actually, I'm done with creating a figure. I'm done with that example. Okay, so let's talk about quotes. I figured this is something that's going to come up a lot, especially for librarians. So notice we've got a paragraph here, and then there's a quote from Huckleberry Finn by Mark Twain. Okay, so let's actually look at, yeah, there it is. This is called a block quote, and notice that there's an attribute in here called cite. So they literally cited this quote, which is something that a screen reader could use, Google could use, your CSS could actually mark that up in a special way. You could have JavaScript that read all of the block quotes and added all of the cite attributes as actual links in maybe a footnotes type thing. A footnote tool or endnote generating tool could actually read this. So this is the standard way in HTML5 to not only set off a quote separate from the rest of the page. Notice it was indented and there was blank lines at the top and the bottom, but you can internally say where you got this quote. So that's what the cite attribute does. It's not really required to add the cite attribute. You could have just made the block quote, and that would have had a very similar effect, or it would have had the same effect, but you wouldn't have that sort of extra metadata along with it. So the block quote sets this off, it indents it, it puts a blank line above and below, and it's just a very common thing to do. You can also quote inline, so as a phrase. You'll have to read more about that in the chapter, but I wanted to mention the block quote because it's just so common. Okay? Alright, so occasionally you need to actually demonstrate code, like maybe HTML or PHP or Java or CSS, like display it on the page. And notice that the font here is a little bit different than the Times New Roman. It's actually a monospace font, which is really, really common for coding. So if I switch over to my text editor, this is what I mean by a monospace font. Whenever you're coding, there's no markup applied by whatever your editor is, like here in BB Edit. It doesn't make these bold or italics. It does color coding, but it doesn't actually, I can't make these bold or italics or change the font around. And if you want to display that on a page, the tag is code/code. So notice everything from 13 to 15, this stuff, am I looking at the right one? Pre-formatted text. No, I'm not. Wrong one. Sorry, guys. There it is. There's use of code anyway. There it is. So you can see that just by putting it inside the code tag, it shows up in that other font. Notice what you have to do with HTML. There are some special characters to display the less than and the greater than symbol in HTML. That's the ampersand LT semicolon, like this guy right here, and ampersand GT semicolon. So if you want to display the less than and the greater than symbol, you've got to actually put this weird chunk of code. That way the browser won't try to interpret the greater than or less than as part of HTML, and it'll actually display it on the page for the user to see. Okay? So you got a couple of different examples. Here's a chunk of code that looks like it comes from PHP. Here's a chunk of code that's meant to be HTML, which is why it's got the less than and the greater than. And here's a chunk of code that's supposed to be CSS, which I recognize and you may not recognize yet, but it does mention that there. So that's, if you know you're going to be writing code for someone on a web page to view, you generally encase it in the code/code. Okay, let's keep going. This is a very similar idea, pre-formatting text. If you know for a fact that you're going to be displaying a lot of code, or maybe you've gotten text from an email and you want it to show up exactly as it did in the email, you can actually place that inside pre. So anything in between pre and /pre, the browser doesn't try to mess around with the blank lines or the tabs. It displays it exactly as it would if this were in a text editor. Because in HTML, the extra spaces are actually ignored. So if I come in between this paragraph right here, up in here, and I add a bunch of blank lines, this actually will have no effect on the way the browser displays that. Add and this will still be on one line. It'll still just be one space. HTML ignores extra white space. It treats all of it as one. Even if I tab and hit enter, all of that does no good in terms of what the browser displays. It treats all white space as basically one white space. That's one of the benefits of using pre/pre. Everything's now exactly as it was. The browser won't try and do anything weird with the white space. It treats it just like it was. Okay, and one more thing about white space while we're at it. Sometimes you want to force the browser to go to the next line, and that's where the BR tag comes in, like in the example of this address here. So, no, don't save. I did some editing there. Oh, and there's my page template. Here's one I want to look at. So if you want to force text to be on its own line without adding a blank line in between, without using the paragraph, like notice that all of this address is inside a paragraph, but each individual line has a BR at the end. That means when the browser gets to this spot right here, it moves the text to the front of the next line. Now you can, if you want, actually put the code all together, but I'm telling you, if the user is expected to see 53 North Railway Street on one line and Okotoks, Alberta on its own line, when the HTML author writes it, you should put it on its own line too. So you can, if you want, put all this together like this. And then the browser will treat this like a blank line and put the stuff on the right of that on its own line and do the same thing here. But I'm telling you that as the HTML author, if it's supposed to display that way in the browser, display it that way in the code too. It makes it easier to read. So notice that even with line 13 all being all together, it still showed up. See in both examples. We got 3 different lines. Even though the HTML is one line, it shows up as 3 different lines. Okay, that's kind of a rundown of some of the things in chapter 4. There's a lot more there, so you need to read it, but that's kind of a way to get you started on that. Okay, great.